The winter winds howled against the stone walls of Pembroke Castle in January 1457, carrying with them the chill of a kingdom at war and the silence of a night that history almost chose to forget. Inside a dimly lit chamber, flickering tallow candles cast long, uncertain shadows on cold flagstones. A girl, not yet a woman, lay trembling on a coarse linen sheet, her small hands clenching the edges until her knuckles turned white. She was only 13, her name was Margaret Beaufort. What unfolded that night was not the celebrated birth of a prince, nor the triumphant arrival of a royal heir as later chroniclers preferred to romanticize. It was a scene of desperation, fear, and an almost certain brush with death. The midwives, seasoned women accustomed to hardship, whispered their doubts as they worked. They had delivered countless children, but rarely had they seen a body so unready for the ordeal. Her pelvis was narrow, her frame slight, her childhood unfinished. In the dim haze, each contraction became a battle between nature and the cruel ambitions of men who had never risked their own flesh for power. To understand this night, we must step back and examine the forces that placed Margaret in that bed, torn between childhood and mortality. Born in 1443 at Bletsoe Castle, she entered a world where noble blood was both a blessing and a curse. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, died within her first year, his death whispered to be suicide, a stain in medieval England that carried spiritual disgrace and political vulnerability. From that moment, Margaret ceased to be seen as a daughter. She became an asset, a vessel of inheritance, a pawn to be placed where men of influence might profit. By the age of 3, she was already a bride in name, bound by contract to the son of the Duke of Suffolk, an alliance arranged not for affection but for advantage. Such arrangements, though not uncommon, were seldom consummated in childhood. Even the harsh logic of the 15th century understood the mortal risks of forcing a girl too young. But England was unraveling. The Wars of the Roses loomed like a gathering storm, and with turmoil came desperation. Margaret's wealth and titles were a lure few could resist. At 12, she was given again, this time to Edmund Tudor, a man twice her age and half-brother to King Henry VI. It was this union, hurried and coldly calculated, that set the stage for the night in Pembroke Castle. Medieval custom often dictated that such marriages wait for maturity before consummation. 14 was the unspoken threshold. Younger, and the risks were known, whispered, dreaded, but Edmund Tudor had reason to act quickly. Under the laws of the time, if Margaret were to die without a child, her lands would revert to her family. If she bore a son, even if she died in the process, he would retain her fortune for life. And so, barely into her 12th year, she was forced into a woman's role before her body had reached a woman's form. Within months, she was with child. By the following winter, she was in labor, isolated, vulnerable, her husband already dead of war or plague, and her own survival uncertain. The chronicles written later under the shadow of the Tudor Rose glossed over the terror of that night. They celebrated the outcome, the birth of Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, founder of a dynasty. But the truth is more harrowing. Labor stretched for hours, perhaps days. Each hour that passed tore at her strength and her body's fragile frame. Contemporary accounts describe her as of small personage, a phrase that barely hints at the physical toll. When at last the infant was born alive, it was called a miracle, but miracles, as any historian will tell you, often arise from human suffering unseen. The room smelled of blood and smoke when it was over. Margaret, pale and exhausted, would never bear another living child. That night left scars no court physician could mend and no chronicler could erase, scars that shaped the woman she became, calculating, devout, relentless, and fiercely protective of the only son she would ever have. This is not merely a birth story. It is a window into the mechanics of power in 15th century England, where a child's body could be a battlefield, and where the fate of a kingdom might rest on the breaking of a girl's health. History remembers the Tudors for their splendor, their ambition, their thrones won and lost. But in rooms like the one at Pembroke, history was written in a different ink, in the sweat of terrified children and the cold logic of men who measured time not in lives, but in inheritances. Before we follow Margaret Beaufort's rise to influence, we must not turn away from this moment, the night when a dynasty was born and a childhood was sacrificed. The months that followed Margaret Beaufort's harrowing childbirth were marked by silence, a silence that often followed the survival of those who were not expected to live. At 13, she was not only a mother, but also a widow. Edmund Tudor, the man who had claimed her youth, had died before his son drew his first breath. Disease had swept through the region during the Wars of the Roses, and whether it was plague or battle sickness, it left her alone with a newborn in her arms and a kingdom at war around her. The England she faced was neither secure nor kind to young widows. In the mid-15th century, a woman of wealth and inheritance was rarely her own master. Instead, she was a link in a chain of property, a piece of the political board moved at will by more powerful hands. With Edmund gone, her fate fell to his brother, Jasper Tudor. A man of stern will and cautious ambition who understood the precarious value of what she carried, a living heir of royal blood. Jasper, to his credit, did not discard her as so many might have done. He provided her a measure of protection within the cold halls of Pembroke and later in the fortified shadows of his estates, but protection in those days was never without price. The young Margaret, still frail from the wounds of labor, was now a figure of calculation. Her son, Henry Tudor, was a fragile infant whose claim to the throne was distant but real. If the Lancastrian cause, already faltering, were to find new life, it would be through such children, through marriages, alliances, and symbols that kept the flame of legitimacy flickering. For Margaret, survival became a form of politics. She was forced to navigate the court of men decades her senior, men who spoke of loyalty and bloodlines but measured everything in estates and coin. Records from this time depict her as precociously intelligent, devout to the point of severity, and already marked by a resolve uncommon in women of her age. She attended Mass daily, clutched her rosary as though it were a shield, and learned the art of patience, when to speak, when to kneel, when to appear as nothing more than a pious girl so that the ambitions of others might pass over her. Yet danger was constant. The Wars of the Roses had turned England into a game of shifting allegiances. Nobles rose and fell with terrifying speed, one season a friend of the king, the next a traitor on the scaffold. The Tudor brothers were Lancastrians by blood, but their hold on power was tenuous. Jasper often left to command armies or negotiate alliances, leaving Margaret and the infant Henry in the care of retainers. There were whispers of plots to seize the child, to raise him as a pawn for rival factions, or worse, to end his life before it could become a threat. It is here, in the fragile years of her widowhood, that the foundations of Margaret Beaufort's later power were laid. Unlike many noblewomen who faded into quiet marriages or cloisters, she observed, she endured, and she remembered. She learned to write letters with caution, to seal them with discretion, and to pledge her loyalty only when the scales of fortune were clear. Above all, she learned to see her son not only as a boy but as a future, a singular chance to restore what had been taken from her, agency, influence, a legacy of her own. The chronicles of the time speak little of her private grief. Perhaps they did not care to ask, or perhaps Margaret, ever conscious of the uses of history, chose to bury her own sorrow beneath the roles expected of her. Widow, mother, ward, but the records are clear on one matter: she resisted further attempts to exploit her body for gain. Her later marriages, arranged as all noble marriages were, remained unconsummated. The scars left by her first were too deep, the dangers too clear. In this, she defied an age that demanded women sacrifice their flesh for politics. Thus, the girl who nearly died at 13 became, by 15, a figure of resilience. She had no army, no treasury, no throne. What she had was sharper memory, patience, and an heir whose blood, though untested, bore the trace of kings. In the game of dynasties, such a piece was rarely left idle. As Margaret Beaufort entered her later teenage years, England descended further into the chaos that chroniclers would immortalize as the Wars of the Roses. For many, this was a struggle between two rival branches of the royal house, Lancaster and York, yet for women like Margaret, it was something far more intimate, a war waged in marriage contracts, wardships, and whispered negotiations in smoke-filled chambers. By 1461, the Yorkist cause had triumphed at Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Henry VI fled, the Lancastrian court scattered, and the infant Henry Tudor, barely 4 years old, was now a prize for either side to claim or destroy. Margaret, still little more than a girl herself, was swept into a political maelstrom that offered her neither comfort nor true allegiance. She was a widow with a son who represented a fragile thread of royal blood to the victors. Such a child was a potential rallying point; to the vanquished, he was hope incarnate. The Yorkists understood this danger well. Edward Roman IV, young and ambitious, began to consolidate his rule, rewarding his allies and punishing those who had dared to stand for Lancaster. Margaret's Tudor kin fell from favor, and Jasper Tudor was forced into exile. With him went the fragile shield that had protected her. Alone, she faced a court now hostile to her name. A court that saw her not as a girl marked by suffering, but as a symbol of resistance yet to come. It was in these precarious years that Margaret revealed the first glimmer of the political acumen for which she would later be renowned. She could not wield a sword, she could not command an army, but she could watch, listen, and maneuver within the spaces women were allowed to occupy, through piety, through correspondence, through the delicate art of promising loyalty without ever truly surrendering her cause. Her survival strategy took shape in a series of calculated decisions. First, she sought reconciliation rather than rebellion. She pledged obedience to the Yorkist king while quietly safeguarding her son's inheritance. This was no small feat. Many Lancastrian heirs were stripped of their lands, their titles extinguished. Yet Margaret managed to retain a portion of her estates and, more importantly, to keep Henry under her legal claim. Second, she remarried, though this, too, was no romance. Her new husband, Sir Henry Stafford, was a Yorkist sympathizer with courtly connections. The marriage offered her a degree of safety under Edward Roman IV reign, a shield against outright confiscation. But she was careful. Like her later unions, this marriage remained largely political and by most accounts unconsummated. Margaret had learned the cost of childbirth too young. She would not risk her life again for another man's ambition. Throughout this period, Margaret cultivated a reputation that both concealed and empowered her to the outward eye. She was devout, humble, almost excessively so, rising before dawn for Mass, funding chapels, corresponding with confessors. Yet piety was also her mask. In an age when women of ambition were often maligned as schemers or witches, Margaret cloaked her calculations in prayer. Behind her rosaries and veils, she mapped alliances, remembered slights, and weighed the shifting balance of power. All the while, her son grew in shadow. Henry Tudor spent much of his early life in uncertain exile, at times hidden in Wales, at times under the wary protection of his uncle Jasper, and later in the safety of Brittany. Margaret's letters, carefully worded, reached across the Channel, carrying a mother's counsel and a strategist's foresight. She urged patience, obedience when necessary, and readiness when fortune turned. Historians have long debated whether Margaret, during these years, already imagined her son as a future king. The evidence suggests something more subtle. She did not dream wildly, she prepared cautiously. The throne of England was not yet his to seize, but it was his to inherit should the tides of war shift again. And in the 15th century, the tides always shifted. By the time she reached her 20s, Margaret Beaufort was no longer the frail child who had nearly died in childbirth. She had become something far more enduring, a presence in the Game of Thrones that could not be erased, a woman whose apparent submission masked a relentless will. She was a pawn, yes, but a pawn that learned the board, memorized every move, and waited for the moment when pawns became queens. By the early 1470, England appeared to rest under Yorkist dominion. Edward Roman IV, charming and ruthless in equal measure, had secured his throne through bloodshed and political cunning. Yet in the shadowed halls of noble estates and the dim corners of cloisters, men and women still whispered of Lancaster, its lost king, its scattered heirs, and the slim, flickering hope that one day the red rose might bloom again. Among these whisperers was Margaret Beaufort. No longer a mere widow in obscurity, she had become a figure of quiet significance. Her marriage to Sir Henry Stafford had offered her a fragile security, but with his death in 1471, she was once again unmoored, free in name, yet exposed to the ambitions of others. Her son, Henry Tudor, now a teenager, remained in exile across the sea, living under the uncertain hospitality of the Duke of Brittany. Each year apart deepened her resolve. If she could not protect him by her side, she would protect his future by any means. The political landscape was shifting. Edward Roman IV reign, though stable compared to the years before, was marred by factional rivalry. The great nobles who had carried him to victory now nursed their own ambitions. The Earl of Warwick, once the kingmaker, had turned traitor and perished. The seeds of betrayal had been sown among brothers, cousins. In-laws, seeds that Margaret, ever observant, learned to water only when the moment was ripe. It was during this unsettled period that she entered her third and most consequential marriage, to Thomas Stanley, a man whose name would one day echo through the final act of the Wars of the Roses. Stanley was no ardent Lancastrian nor a sworn Yorkist. He was, above all, a survivor, cautious, calculating, and capable of wearing loyalty like a cloak to be turned at will. Margaret found a partner of sorts, not in affection but in advantage. Through the Stanleys she gained access to court once more. She attended the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, and by outward show became a figure of piety and service. Yet beneath the veil she began laying the threads of conspiracy, subtle at first, whispers carried in letters and through trusted confessors. Her correspondence with her son grew more daring. She urged him to maintain his Lancastrian name, but to bide his time. Rashness would doom them both. The opportunity she awaited came not in triumph, but in death. Edward Roman IV died suddenly in 1483, leaving his young sons, Edward V and his brother Richard, in the hands of their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Within months, those boys vanished into the Tower of London, and Richard Roman III claimed the crown. The realm that had seemed secure once again fractured. For Margaret Beaufort, the chaos was a summons. She saw in Richard Roman III not a savior, but a tyrant whose rule would breed resentment among Yorkist loyalists as surely as it enraged Lancastrians. Her network of alliances expanded, stretching from exiled lords in Brittany to discontented nobles in England. She began to advocate for a bold and dangerous idea: the union of her son, Henry Tudor, with Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward Roman IV. Such a marriage would unite the red rose of Lancaster with the white of York and offer a single figure around whom a weary nation might rally. This was no idle scheme. It was a gamble of dynastic proportions, and it placed Margaret at the heart of treason. For a woman whose life had been defined by the ambitions of men, it was an audacious reversal. Now she was the one weaving the web, deciding which threads would hold and which would be cut. Historians often debate how much of the plot that followed was truly hers, and how much was the work of disaffected Yorkists seeking any banner to oppose Richard Roman III. But the record is clear. Margaret Beaufort was a conspirator, a financier, and a messenger in the movement that would eventually bring her son to Bosworth Field. The girl who had once been sacrificed to dynastic necessity had learned to wield dynastic power herself. In the winter of 1483, as she lit her candles and whispered her prayers, the pieces were already in motion. Armies would rise, kings would fall, and in the heart of it all, a woman once silenced in childbirth now prepared to speak through war. In the summer of 1485, as the mists rolled over the fields of Leicestershire, England stood on the cusp of yet another turning point. For over 3 decades, the Wars of the Roses had drenched its soil with the blood of cousins, kings, and would-be heirs. Now the last gamble was at hand. Richard Roman III, crowned amidst whispers of usurpation, marched to meet a challenger who, until recently, had been little more than an exile, Henry Tudor. To many, Henry was a figure almost mythic in his distance, a boy whisked across the Channel, shaped by the courts of Brittany and France, heir to a line long thought extinguished. But to Margaret Beaufort he was flesh of her flesh, the child she had nearly died to bring into the world, the solitary anchor of her long-suffering ambition. Every alliance she had brokered, every secret letter sent in cipher, every coin placed in the hands of mercenaries and captains, it had all led here. The Battle of Bosworth Field has been told in chronicles both sober and romantic. Richard, with his boar's standard and his iron crown, charging headlong into the fray. Henry, cautious yet resolute, keeping his line firm, and in the wings the Stanleys, Thomas, Margaret's husband, and his brother William, watching, waiting, as was their custom, for the wind to favor their sails. When the moment came, their cavalry turned upon the king, and Richard Roman III fell amidst a press of blades. The last English monarch to die in battle. With that fall, a door swung open, not only for Henry, now Henry Roman VII, but for the mother who had raised him not with lullabies, but with strategies whispered in candlelight. Margaret Beaufort did not seize the throne herself, but she became something England had never quite seen, a matriarch whose influence was both maternal and monarchical. She styled herself Margaret R. in her correspondence, a signature that spoke of sovereignty without a crown. Her next act was as decisive as any on the battlefield. She arranged the marriage between her son and Elizabeth of York, uniting the houses that had bled the country dry. From that union came the emblem that still adorns English history books, the Tudor Rose, red and white entwined. To the world, it was a symbol of peace. To Margaret, it was the culmination of decades of survival, sacrifice, and calculation. But power, once grasped, must be wielded. Margaret established herself not in idle luxury, but in deliberate governance. She founded colleges, Christ's College and St. John's at Cambridge, shaping the minds of generations. She became a patron of printing, education, and piety, her image one of serene devotion. Yet beneath that serenity lay the memory of her youth, the torn body of a 13-year-old mother, the silent corridors of Pembroke Castle, the long nights of exile. Historians often ask, did Margaret ever find peace? The answer is elusive. She wielded power with a steady hand, advised her son in council, and even in widowhood retained the authority of a queen dowager. But she never bore another child. The physical scars of that first, brutal labor remained. The psychological ones, too, are glimpsed in her relentless protection of the Tudor line, sometimes tender, often fierce, always calculating. When she died in June 1509, just days after the coronation of her grandson Henry Roman VIII, England stood transformed. The Wars of the Roses were over. A new dynasty had risen, one that would birth monarchs whose names echo still, Henry Roman VIII, Elizabeth I. And at the root of that dynasty lay a woman often remembered as a pious matron, a builder of colleges, a benefactor of the poor. But the fuller truth is darker and more complex. Margaret Beaufort was also the child whose body was broken to make a king. The widow who learned to turn grief into leverage, the mother who turned survival into strategy. Her legacy is not merely the Tudor Rose, but the cost at which it bloomed, a cost measured in blood, in silence, and in the long, patient waiting of a girl who became England's quiet architect. The chroniclers of her age, mostly men, rarely wrote of her inner life, yet her actions speak in a language louder than confession. Resilience forged in pain, ambition carried in prayer. A dynasty birthed not in triumph alone, but in endurance. That is the paradox of Margaret Beaufort, both victim and maker, both pawn and player. And perhaps that is why her shadow still stretches across English history, not as a saint, not as a villain, but as the rarest thing of all in her century, a woman who survived and shaped the fate of a kingdom.